the HPAs that you may have on your, plugging into your storage environment, your servers, right? This idea of upgrades, this is the stuff that has kept, I'd say, my customers up at night in past, because they've lost nights, weekends. It's just time consuming and a little painful. The idea of automation for Nutanix perspective could be as simple as one-click automation of all of that, right? BIOS, BMC, firmware through one click, non-disruptive. Essentially, we have customers that have done that, initiated from their iPhones, right? So that idea of automation of the basic functions of IT management to keep the environment up to date and running fresh. But then you take that up a level into the app stack, the DevOps space. We think about automation in terms of unlocking self-service portals, the catalog of options that you can bring to your customers, so that, again, how much care and feeding, once you've set policy in place, do you have to manually drive? Could we automate that? Could we simplify your life? The answer to that is absolutely a resolute yes. And we'll go to the next slide. All right, we just talk about efficient resource utilization, right? This is something, whether it is on-prem in the context of Nutanix and HPE with our DX platform, or whether that spans into the multi-cloud perspective, being able to bring the same resources, the same data efficiencies that are part and parcel, right? When you think about thin provisioning, you think about compression, deduplication, it's been technologies that have been in play for a while, but to be able to bring that, and then on top of that, you think of resource utilization, eliminating some of the middle layers, right? The idea of sand fabrics being, a necessity, right? That disappears from this equation. Nutanix, from a pure architecture perspective, right, brings the data that you care about, that runs your business, that's powering workloads, and brings it incredibly close to the compute, right? And so in doing that, we're now able to unlock better performance, greater scale, with less actual infrastructure needed to get there, right? So you're getting essentially that, a little cliched here, but this addition through subtraction, but it truly does, taking out some of those layers to unlock performance, unlock better resiliency. And architecture matters. And we believe, and thankfully the industry agrees with us, whether it's Gartner and our position as a leader in the Magic Quadrant, whether it's the Forrester Wave and our position as a leader there as well, or our market share, right, as the leading hyper-converged infrastructure software in the market today, by not a small margin, 52% share in the last Gartner report. That is why, right, we talk about these efficiencies we can bring to bear. We'll go to the next slide. All right, this one is exciting for us as well, not just the proactive support that we have from our software and the wrapper of Nutanix and our simplicity to be able to anticipate, resolve, kind of proactively mitigate any kind of support scenarios so that you have a phenomenal experience, which is, again, you're hearing it from a Nutanix salesperson, so you're always going to take it with a grain of salt. But thankfully, the industry has some markers that we measure that by, and the Net Promoter Score is definitely one of them that we pay a lot of attention to, because it's really our customer's voice rating how we do. And Nutanix has had a 90-point Net Promoter Score for the last 5 years, which is pretty phenomenal. That was a guy who spent a long time at another large technology company, and I think we were doing backflips when we hit plus 30 points as a Net Promoter Score. So Nutanix has really done a great job with customer experience, and that partnership with HPE absolutely brings that up even further. We'll go to the next slide. All right, so from a benefits overall, we think about this kind of cloud computing paradigm. Just to again, to recap what I've just shared with you, we think about the higher level of productivity that your team can have by simplifying the tasks that they do today, by leveraging architectures that are built to bring a cloud-like experience into your environment, and then give you the choice as to where you want to deploy it, in great partnership with a partner like ours, like HPE, from an on-prem perspective, spanning up into the cloud, whether that's AWS or Azure, into bare metal deployments, really giving you that choice to determine what's the best fit. The resource utilization, that absolutely nets out into better total cost of ownership, both hard dollar costs and operational costs. And lastly, look, if it's got a spinning disk or a moving part, it's going to go bump in the night at some point. So how fast does your vendor come to the rescue and make sure that you don't miss a beat when it comes to the workloads that your team's supporting? Nutanix and HPE, we do it better than anybody else in the industry. And obviously, I'm going to say that from a guy from Nutanix. My friends at HPE are going to say the same, but ask your friends. The folks that are our shared customers will validate that. We'll go to the next slide. All right, so I'll just touch on this for a moment. But as I mentioned, when we think about the impact of Nutanix and HPE in our partnership, particularly that ability to look at workloads that you may have in the public cloud today, or you may have on-prem in a three-tier kind of more legacy style of construct architecture. How could Nutanix, right, in partnership with HPE, be able to give you the best choice for where those workloads could be essentially served out of, whether that's on-prem or whether that might be today in the public cloud? What I'll tell you is customers that we work with are pretty shocked to find out that Nutanix clusters, which is Nutanix deployed in the public cloud on AWS or on Azure, bare metal, that in fact represents a better cost of ownership than just deploying to AWS or Azure natively. Now, I'm going to say that again because it's a bit of a shocking statement, and you should challenge us on that. and we are more than willing to take up the challenge and very transparently leverage your data, leverage whatever contracted rates you may have for AWS or for Azure, and show back to you where those cost savings are. As I mentioned, we are seeing really, shocking levels of savings because we're bringing the data services that an AWS or an Azure, essentially, they force fit customers to meet their essentially their paradigm for service levels. Small, medium, large workloads. That's kind of that t-shirt sizing approach, right? And folks that have adopted that probably know that well. If you've got a small workload and it just goes a hair over, right, into that medium workload size, well, that's fine with AWS or Azure because now you're bumping that workload and you're paying that next tier up of contracted rate. What we're able to do is really right size those environments so you get all the data services of on-prem, and now you can bring that to bear and right size the costing in the cloud. And what you may find along the way is that it's a better fit for you to host those in a colo with the Nutanix and HPE part, or to leverage a GreenLake. We'll go to the next slide. All right, and with that, I'm going to very graciously hand the ball off to my friends at HPE to talk a bit about why it is DX is the broadest portfolio for Nutanix.
Thank you very much, Chris. And as an introduction, Ryan Swango here with Hewlett Packard Enterprise. I'm a hybrid IT specialist, and my role within HPE is 100% on focusing on how to help Nutanix grow their market share, while also ensuring that the majority of what they're doing does end up on the DX platform. Now, Chris did a great job in discussing at a high level everything that Nutanix and the HPE relationship does bring to the table. But my role for this presentation will be to kind of discuss a little bit in more detail the underlying technology that works to bring you all that really cool and really neat stuff that Chris brought to the table. So Chris did spend quite a bit of time talking about t-shirt sizing, which is kind of interesting because that plays so nicely into what I want to lead with here today is this relationship with HPE and Nutanix. Now, it's a relatively new relationship in the market. We've been working alongside Nutanix, and it's been a blooming, great partnership for only about a year. Now, interestingly enough, we're the fastest ramping OEM partner, we meaning HPE is the fastest ramping OEM partner that Nutanix has a relationship with. And by that, I mean, we've already exceeded all of their other OEM partners when it comes to revenues and as many models as we offer. So we have 14 models on the truck today. Now, not going to go into any speeds and feeds on any of that, but I do want to emphasize that we do not follow that methodology that one size fits all. We want to ensure that if you are selecting Nutanix, you want it to be on an HPE box. And the reason why is because we have 14 models. We're going to fine tune and fine engineer this solution to work for your needs. And again, as Chris had mentioned, it's a hybrid IT model, so it's hybrid cloud. So this can be on-premise or it can actually be bursting up into your public cloud environments. With these 14 options, these 14 server platforms that we do offer, we have hundreds of individual discrete components that we can place in there, meaning you get your selection of processor, you get your selection of drives, memory, GPUs. We want to ensure that everything that we do is vetted and all of our products are optimized to work the best that they can in the Nutanix environment. Our one-year relationship thus far It's already netted hundreds of million dollars in sales worldwide, and we have thousands upon thousands of units shipped. So, I'd like to reassure you that when we're talking Nutanix, and we do quite a bit within HPE's walls, this product is ramping crazy on our side as well. You're walking into a conversation where it's been tried and true. So many customer installs out there, and I'll get to that a little bit later in the deck. But moving forward, I'd really like to discuss what keeps folks up at night. So during, you can go ahead and advance the slide, please, Kelly. But during COVID, security, it was one of the main factors that was keeping a lot of customers that I was engaged with up at night. I don't think it's any surprise to anyone that the number of remote workers doubled, tripled, quadrupled overnight. And interestingly enough, this is just the perfect storm that bad actors out there want to take advantage of. They know that with these increases in remote workers that are working off of unsecured home networks, that there's going to be tons and tons of new vectors for attack. But the one stat that I'd like to draw your attention to, and yeah, I'm going to take us, purposefully into somewhat of a dark area here. Let me drive you off the cliff. But the Poneman Institute did a study where every 11 seconds by 2021, and now that we're into 2021, this is actually quite a poignant point, is that every 11 seconds, we're running into a cyber attack if you average it out over the year. Kind of a scary proposition. So let me take that a little bit further for you that, there's other studies out there, and this Poneman Institute study was updated for 2020. And what they found was if you're a small company and you get hit with any cyber attack that holds up your data, 60% of SMB, and again, we're talking about the small companies out of SMB, they fail within a 6-month window. So you might be thinking in the back of your head, well, yeah, we might be small, but maybe we're medium, maybe we're large. The scarier thing is there's an additional study out there where it was actually a polling of your customers. So they polled 17 markets, 17 verticals, or whatever you like to call it, 17 industries over 17 countries. So worldwide view. But what they did was they said, how likely are you to work with someone that had a data breach? But that being said, 70% of the folks that were polled, and we're talking tens of thousands of people that were polled for this survey, 70% of those customers said if a company that they were doing business with had a significant level of a data breach, they would no longer do business with that company anymore. So again, not to kind of scare you with this, it's more of a realistic view of what's really going on out there. So what we like to do within HPE is we like to be that sign that you put out in your front yard. Everyone knows that HPE is the most secure server, this most secure industry standard server that's out there today. We do that through a product called the Silicon Root of Trust. It's actually free. It's embedded in all of our Gen 10 and above servers. And every server that goes out the door with Nutanix hand in hand has this technology integrated into it free. But I like to think of it, or I like to compare it to, ADT, that home security company, right? They shove that stake out in the ground right by your front door that says secured and monitored by ADT. In my opinion, within where we sit in the marketplace, with the technologies that we as HPE and Nutanix does, we protect the hardware as HPE. So that hardware level, secure, the securest in the world, best in class. Then we also come in and layer it on top with Nutanix's security for their VMs. And they call that product Nutanix Flow, by the way. What that does is that's us putting our, ADT-like stake in the ground saying, you know what, we're secure, we're monitored. And what does that do? The bad actors are like, you know what, this one might just be too hard for us to tackle. Let's just go to the next one that's a lot easier. So that's one of those things where security really is front of mind. I would say it's the first, possibly the second, if you bring in economics of enduring the COVID pandemic. These are what keep the majority of our customers up at night. So that's one thing that I really love to emphasize. We as HPE, we really, really focus hard line on security. And that's something that is only bolstered by our relationship. It's kind of a yin and yang thing that we do with Nutanix that just makes it that much better. They fill in perfectly for us, and that's why we're so enthusiastic about this relationship. Okay, so moving on. We'd like to also talk, and Chris did do a great job of covering off on AI and what we do there. The product that actually drives us behind the scenes for HPE is a product called Infosight. Nutanix also has a product on their side called Prism Pro. So ultimately what this does, and just at a very, very high level, not getting into too much of the weeds, but this is going to help your customers, this is going to help your administrators with self-healing. It's going to have your environment self-optimized, and just flat out for your business, it's going to eliminate downtime. So how is this done? Well, ultimately, we collect data points from sensors across all of our install base across the world, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of sensors. All that is aggregated, and what it does is it basically makes operating these systems fault-proof. And again, this is one of those things where, guess what? It sounds pricey, sounds too good to be true. This ships for free with all HPE servers. This ships for free with all Nutanix DX ProLiant offerings as well. So through this engagement with Nutanix and HPE, you're getting a lot of benefits, a lot of cool stuff that comes along that's really going to help you optimize your business. And just to kind of sum up this point is it's going to free up your administrators. It's going to take them from that tedious, let's make sure we're doing everything we can to keep the lights on. And we're going to eliminate a lot of those support-related incidents that really do take a lot of time and a lot of focus out of your business. So let's move on to our next point. We're going to be covering off on GreenLake. And I'm hoping that everyone here has heard of GreenLake. It's a great offering out of HPE. It's not a product per se. It's more of a consumption model. So on one hand, how we used to procure technology in the past, it was a large purchase order, or it was some sort of a built-in lease that would still be based off of a hard cost, a hard acquisition cost for a bunch of hardware that would ultimately end up on site. Now with HPE GreenLake, the neat thing about it is you're getting the benefits of the cloud. So you get the economic and the pay-per-use benefits of the cloud. But what you're doing is we're actually framing this up in a way that it's allowing the products, the servers that we're operating off of to run within your data center. So the neat thing about this, you get benefits of cloud, you get the security, you get the speed, and you get the control of having it on premise. So it's one of those things where if you haven't heard of this, I would encourage you to take a deeper look at it. But right when the Nutanix relationship was founded, this was the first thing that we as an internal team tackled. We wanted this to be accessible to our Nutanix peers and to anyone out there looking to procure and match kind of that purchasing model that they're doing in public cloud. Again, blending that together with the hybrid cloud model, but doing it in a way that all the hardware is within your control. It's within your data center. So pretty powerful stuff. But what we've noticed over time, you can see the little statistic here on the screen, but we've noticed that folks are saving 65% in their deployment time when compared to a traditional 3-tier rack and stack type environment. So it's one of those things that's not only a cost saver, it helps eliminate those rigid procurement cycles where you're looking to purchase new hardware, for example, to run some workloads within your environment. And by doing so, you need to plan out 3 years in advance. Well, with GreenLake, we take all that thought out of it for you. And what we do is we put on enough processing power, compute power, storage, whatever you need. We put enough on site. We also add in a buffer to encourage you to utilize and really react to flexes in demand. So that buffer, it'll allow you to scale up and scale back by day, by week, by month. And in doing so, it eliminates, again, those lengthy refresh cycles where you need to ensure that you put together a bill of materials and do that purchasing process, which sometimes takes up to 3 months. This is quick, this is rapid, It's all ready to go. So with that being said, that's one of the key value adds that we as HPE bring to this new Nutanix relationship. It's an awesome thing for us within HPE. We're seeing it grow at tremendous rates year over year, and it may just very well turn into the purchasing mechanism of the future. So with that being said, I'd like to talk about one more thing, and then we'll recap. So the collaboration here, again, what you're seeing out of HPE and Nutanix is you're gonna start to see a much easier life for your administrators. And what this does is it frees them up to focus on more proactive activities that really drive business growth for you. But the collaboration here, through our tools, we offer one-click upgrades to all of the key elements of the system and software. And that's one of the benefits that you're gonna see out of HPE and Nutanix. So with that being said, let's recap this, and we can continue to we can get the whiskey tasting going. So that being said, we already have a ton of really large wins collectively as HPE and Nutanix. We've done a great job, you can see here on the screen, selling into what I would call the creme de la creme, the large enterprises out there. But we've also seen a lot of success further downstream as well. Small businesses love it, medium-sized businesses love it. And the reason why, and as we continue forward on the slides, I mean, I'll recap it very, very simply for you. Kelly, if you could please move forward. What we offer is basically at price parity to other OEM partners that Nutanix works with. We offer security. It's the most secure hardware and software offering out there in the hyperconverged space. We offer AI problem solving. It's built in. Security is built in. AI problem solving built in. And the economics of the cloud. All this is built into this offering. It's really scaled in a way to offer the most flexibility for your business needs. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Kelly to see if there's any questions out there that we can help address. Again, you have Chris and myself, and there's a series of experts on the line as well behind the scenes that can help you out as well. So Kelly, over to you.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for that. We are going to be accepting questions via chat. So we've been getting back to everybody individually. So if you have any questions for the remainder of the session, please do utilize that chat feature and we will get back to you. But without further ado, I'm actually going to send it over to Andrew.
Alrighty. How's it going, guys? Am I coming through video and audio? Doing all right?
Yep, you're good.
Good.
Perfect. Hello, guys. My name is Andrew Anderson, and I'm the front of house manager at Balcones Distilling. We're located in Waco, Texas. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about kind of like Whiskey 101, give you guys hopefully like a really good basis of knowledge of whiskey and kind of how to taste whiskey and evaluate it, to give you guys a little bit of context. What is Balcones? We were founded in 2008. We are a grain to glass distillery. So what that means is everything from milling the grains, brewing, fermentation, distillation, aging, we do all that on site. Our main focus is, for the most part, single malt whiskeys, but we also have some different styles like bourbons and ryes that we produce. And we started out back in 2008 in this small little welding shop. It's about the same size of the tasting room that I'm in now. It's about 2,000 square feet. And in 2012, we were selected for a competition that's based in the UK that was called the Best in Glass Award. And we won that competition with a 15-month-old single malt that we had made. Not only that, it was the first time an American distillery had won the competition. And in the industry, it was really cool. We were a really young distillery at that time. Our production was really, really small. And then as it was making its way around the industry, the New York Times had caught on to this and wrote an article about our distillery in their food and drink section, which is pretty much blown up our popularity. People know us from all over the world. A little bit about us, but whiskey. There's questions I get all the time at the distillery of, like, what is whiskey? Which I feel like is a really good place to start off. Think of whiskey as like music. And not to kind of oversell what we do, but whiskey is similar to music, and that's kind of like an art form. but there's also different ways to describe it. So whiskey at the heart of it is a distilled spirit made from grain that must be distilled below 95% alcohol by volume. If you distill it above 95% ABV, it is then legally vodka at that point. And another one I get is like, where does the word whiskey come from? Why is it spelled differently depending on where you're at? And that actually is thanks to Scotland and Ireland. So the Gaelic term originally, what we called whiskey, was whiskey beha. And as they started translating that Gaelic phrase into English, which means water of life, they changed it. They had the current spelling that we know now being whiskey, with Scotland spelling whiskey without an E and Ireland spelling whiskey with an E. And a really helpful way that I tell people to be able to remember which country is going to adhere to which spelling is that if whiskey is spelled, or if the country has the letter E in the name, that they're going to spell it whiskey with an E. So Ireland and America being the two big ones. And then countries that whose name doesn't contain the letter E are going to be spelling it whiskey without an E. So think Canada, Scotland, Japan, India. Those, for the most part, are going to be spelling it whiskey without an E. Here at Balcones, we spell whiskey without an E because we follow more of the Scottish style of distillation, which is double pot distillation, which is just a different way of production to get to making the spirit, which makes it a little bit more full bodied, a little bit more rustic, a little bit more depth and character to the spirit, which is something that we really look for in a spirit. But from that overarching description of whiskey, you have, similar to music, you have like genres. One of the more popular ones in the United States, since Prohibition ended essentially, is bourbon. It is the native spirit of the United States. Thanks to President Johnson, he actually signed that into law. And bourbon is the only whiskey that can only be made in the United States. Despite what what your friends from Kentucky may say, you can make bourbon whiskey outside of Kentucky, just not outside of the United States. Bourbon must be made from at least 51% corn in the mash bill. So of the grains used, over half of it has to be corn. Another stipulation is that it must be aged in new charred oak barrels. Whether you use American oak, European oak, French oak, they don't really care as long as it's a new charred oak barrel. For it to be a straight bourbon, it must be at least 2 years in a barrel. So it must be at least 2 years old to be a straight bourbon. Some other things is that bourbon cannot be distilled above 80% alcohol by volume. It can also not go into a barrel at above 62.5% ABV. And then another popular style, and one that was kind of like the original American whiskey, being rye whiskey. It was the first thing that we started distilling. Some of the first settlers in the United States were Dutch immigrants, and a grain they were really familiar with was rye. Rye has very similar legal definitions to bourbon. One of the key differences is that it must be 51% rye as opposed to the corn content. American rye whiskey also must be aged in new charred oak barrels. Can also not be distilled above 80% ABV. For it to be straight, it must be at least 2 years in a barrel, and it cannot be bottled below 40% ABV. Rye whiskey was so popular up until Prohibition to the point that a lot of the original cocktail recipes that we see for old fashions, Manhattans, whiskey sours, so on and so forth, they would write it down as whiskey, but it was understood that it was a rye whiskey. And rye whiskey's popularity started waning during Prohibition because it was the sell word during the time, and people with not the strongest moral compass would sell either really cut whiskey or really improperly made whiskey, stuff that contained like wood alcohols that could like seriously injure people. They were marketing them as rye whiskeys. And a side effect of that is that people started having this negative connotation about rye whiskey. And so they started transitioning into Canadian ryes. And then once Prohibition was repealed, bourbon started filling that slot. Rye has started having a resurgence in the last few years. So it's been gaining in popularity. And then finally, probably one of the biggest growers and kind of the new kid on the block are American single malts. And that's kind of this is our flagship whiskey, it's our Texas single malt. American single malts are very new in the United States as far as production. So new, in fact, that the federal government does not even have a legal definition for what a American single malt is. So ourselves, as well as some other distilleries, another big one being Westland out of Seattle, Washington, are working with legislatures to actually create a legal definition for an American single malt. Some of the things that we're advocating for is that it must be made and aged in the United States. I feel like that's a pretty given. And a single malt means that it's made from 100% malted barley, and then it comes from one distillery. Or multigrain, typically the grain being used is barley. And so Balcones would have to make all the whiskey themselves from malted grain, must be aged solely here in the States. As far as barrels, we're allowing for producers to use either new or used barrels. We don't really want to try to dictate that, but similar to bourbon and rye, cannot be distilled above 80% ABV, can't go into a barrel at above 62.5%, and can't go into a barrel at above or below 40%, or go into a bottle below 40% ABV. So those are three of the more kind of popular whiskeys. And one thing I always get at the distillery is people ask, like, how do you drink whiskey? And this is always like one of my favorite parts in the demonstration, because I get to drink a little whiskey, you know, lead by example. And I am going to be pouring up a little bit of this single malt for this little test, kind of a little how-to. It's super delicious. So one thing that I see a lot of people do is that they try to compare or like translate a whiskey tasting from what they've learned of like beer or wine tastings, since beer and wine tastings have been popular in the US much longer than whiskey tastings have. People just kind of take what they know and try to carry it over. And it doesn't always work that great, because with beer and wine being like 4% up to like 16% ABV, our American single malt, for instance, that I'll be trying today is 106 proof or 53% ABV. And so whenever like with a beer or wine tasting, when you're getting your nose really deep in the glass and you like breathe in so that we can get those aromatics and aromas from the beer or the wine, if you do that with a glass of whiskey, you're just going to end up inhaling a bunch of ethanol, which will temporarily numb the nasal receptors in your nose, which will lead to you actually getting less aroma and flavor off the spirit. So before you even nose it though, the first thing you always want to do with a glass of whiskey is kind of do a visual inspection of it. You want to look at like color. Is it a little bit softer or paler in color? Is it like more of like a straw or kind of gold color? Or does it start working its way more to those kind of like darker amber kind of mahogany colors? And those can kind of tell you a few different things. With it being a little bit of a lighter whiskey, it means it's either going to be a little bit on the younger side, or it is a whiskey that was aged in used barrels. A really good example of that is Scotch. Even though most Scotches out there kind of start off at like 12 years, it's kind of like the baseline. They age their whiskeys almost exclusively in used bourbon barrels. Because those barrels have been used before, there's not a lot of these like residual wood sugars, which impart all of the color and a lot of the flavor. Whereas when you have a darker whiskey, like our American single malt, it's a pretty good indication that was aged in a new barrel, because a lot of those caramelized wood sugars are still sitting in the barrel. They haven't been pulled out through maturation. So I'll kind of help give you some visual cues. Also, another thing to look for is clarity, because depending on production of it, or if a whiskey's been oxidized, it'll start having this kind of cloudy appearance to it. That may give you a good idea that the bottle may have been compromised. So just kind of keep that in mind. Back to kind of the nosing the whiskey. A good practice, especially if you're starting off and you're kind of like learning how to nose whiskey, is to start with the glass a little bit further out from your nose than you see reasonable, and then slowly start bringing that glass closer to your nose. And then once you bring the glass to your nose to the point that you're picking up these ethanol vapors, that means the glass is too close. And so just pull back just slightly to the point that you're getting those aromas, but you're not getting a lot of the ethanol bite. So you want to just kind of bring it to a certain point, smelling that ethanol. So I'm going to kind of pull back a little bit. And you may notice that I'm not holding the glass just straight up and down. The reason being is that your nasal passages actually have different flow rates. My right nostril is not as strong as my left. And depending on how your nasal cavity is structured, you might actually start kind of pitching the glass to one direction or another, and that'll actually help give you a more full experience. Each nostril will kind of start picking up different aromas and kind of lead to a little bit more complexity. As far as kind of like, people always say like, it just kind of like smells like whiskey. That stuff will come with time. And as you start familiarizing yourself with whiskey, your brain, because all flavors are just our brains identifying these compounds and then trying to associate it with something that we've had before. That's why it smells like leather or like nail polish or whatever it is, peaches. That's because we have like a context for that. And so our brains are like, oh, cool, that smells like peaches. And that's where you start getting those nuanced notes. Just kind of take a little bit of time with the whiskey, nose it. There's no rush. And just kind of take your time, and there's no right or wrong answer because taste is subjective. So what you're tasting or what your experience is yours, and no one can take that away from you. You're not wrong. There's no like superiority in that sense. But then once you kind of taken some time with the whiskey and you guys become acquainted with one another, the fun part starts, and that's tasting of the whiskey. And especially with your first sip of whiskey, helpful thing is that you want to start off with a smaller sip, because with that first sip of whiskey, your palate's getting acclimated to the presence of alcohol. You're not necessarily going to get the full complexity of the spirit on that first sip. But when you take a sip, you want that spirit to kind of sit on your tongue for a little bit, let it work its way around, because different tongues are more receptive to picking up different flavors. But a more important benefit is a reaction called retronasal olfaction. And what's happening is while the spirit's sitting on your tongue, those aromas are traveling back up to your nasal cavity. And that's where you're actually getting the complexity of like floral bouquets or fruit, leather, oak, any of those things that you associate as like a certain fruit or item or whatever it is, tobacco. That's actually coming from your nose and not your tongue. So just a quick little sip just to make sure, there's nothing funny with this bottle. That's good. It's got like a lot of spice, a lot of those peaches. I've been drinking this that single malt. That's not goodbye. That's gonna be a see you later. I'll deal with you later. But yeah, lastly, now you guys kind of know a little bit about whiskey, its history, maybe some different styles. One thing I always like to kind of pass off to people, especially during these things, is how to make an old fashioned. To me, being able to make an old fashioned is the bar equivalent of being able to fry an egg. I feel like everyone should be able to know how to make an old fashioned. It's very, very simple. I feel like it's a drink that's beautiful in its simplicity. And first off, I mean, making cocktails is one of the most American things you can do. Cocktail culture was the original cultural export of the United States. And this is at a time when, you went a day's ride out west and people were living very simple lives. Like there wasn't a lot of like developed city. We weren't contributing a lot in the intellectual world as far as like science, philosophy, any of that stuff. But this very unique American individualism started happening, which is part of what makes our country very great. Because we went from a time of more like punch communal drinking, and it was very cost prohibitive. To give you an idea, like a bowl of punch would cost what an average person made in a week. So it was very exclusive. It's more for the tippity top of the culture of society. And as Americans started drinking, that individualism started developing, and it was like, I don't want my drink the way Kelly's having it. I want to have my drink my own way. And so making individual drinks for individual people started developing. And once that happened, it just exploded. It went all over the world, even more so during Prohibition, whenever being a bartender was illegal. Up to that time, being a bartender was just as respectable as being a lawyer or a doctor. And then Prohibition kind of drove everyone underground. But the essential of a cocktail, or the most traditional definition of it, is a spirit made from sugar, spirits, bitters, and water. Water is one of those things that people don't really take into account for. Usually it's like ice, because you need dilution, or else the drink can be a little bit aggressive, can be a little bit too harsh. With the old fashioned, I always really advise using a larger piece of ice, because an old fashioned is not a drink you're just going to knock back. It's something you're going to kind of sip on for a while and really appreciate, just because it is a stronger cocktail. And if you use smaller ice, the surface area is much smaller and it's going to melt a lot faster. And so the benefit of using a larger piece of ice is that the old fashioned from beginning to end isn't going to change nearly as much as if you use a bunch of smaller ice. But in that glass, we got our ice ready to go. And me personally, I'm a big fan of rye old fashions. I feel like there's kind of like some beauty and tradition. But before we add the spirit, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding the bitters. And that's because the bitters are one of the few things, whoop, if I can just get it off. There we go. Actually, here we go. Have a backup bottle just in case. We'll just be adding a, whoop, oh no. Okay, fresh one. Sorry about that. See, some of the, even bartenders make mistakes from time to time. Get a fresh piece of ice and a little bit more of a reasonable amount of bitters. Just a few dashes. It's a really intense, think of it almost similar to vanilla extract. It's a bunch of herbs and spices that are pretty heavily concentrated. So now that we have the bitters in there, we're gonna be adding 2 ounces of rye. I just really enjoy rye old fashioned. Those kind of like spice notes really carry through and they're super enjoyable. For me, I'm a big fan of 2 ounce pour for an old fashioned. I feel like if you're gonna make an old fashioned, you need to have a healthy amount of whiskey. And lastly, what we need to do before we garnish is we need to add a little bit of sugar. It's gonna help pull everything together, add like some texture to it. And I'm a big fan of using a rich demerara or turbinado sugar. It's a less refined sugar. It's gonna add more than just sweetness. You'll add these cool kind of like deeper molasses notes to it. And then from there, we're gonna just start stirring. And the idea is that with spirit-based cocktails, because they're similar weights and it doesn't take a lot for those ingredients to come together, stirring is a little bit more advised. Also, it helps with the texture because with a shaken drink, all those tiny air bubbles will add this slightly kind of prickliness, which is for like a spirit-based cocktail, a little bit off-putting. Again, there are some people that are kind of into that kind of thing, but for me, I just kind of like that silky velvetyness that an old-fashioned, a traditional stirred old-fashioned can produce. And it doesn't take too terribly long. We don't want to dilute the drink too much. We just kind of want to stir long enough for all the ingredients to come together. And then lastly, we're going to add a garnish. Typically, it's the kind of any citrus you want to use. The more popular ones are either going to be orange or lemon. For me, especially with a rye old fashioned, I really like lemon. It has this nice kind of like brightness that helps kind of complement the spice of the rye, but also kind of cut a little bit of that sweetness from the sugar that we've added in. Orange is a really awesome option as well, especially for a bourbon old fashioned. Twist of orange is chef's kiss. But you can just take a Y peeler. If you want, you can just use a paring knife. You just want to make sure you don't pick up too much pith when you're doing that, because pith is actually bitter and it will result in the cocktail having this like slightly kind of like bitterness to it. That can be off-putting to some people depending on how receptive you are to bitterness. So I'm just gonna take my standard little Y peeler, and then you can kind of see as I'm making my twist, we're getting that lemon peel. I was doing it over the glass. I know you probably couldn't pick it up, but there's these oils that are coming off the lemon. And as opposed to it just being wasted on my bar top, those are making their way onto the top of the glass, helping add to those aromatics. And then before we do anything else, we're gonna take our lemon peel and just kind of grab it on each end, and you just bring your fingers together, just give a nice little pinch, get those oils out as best you can. You want to kind of run it on the outside of the glass, as well as on the inside. And then just for presentation, it's not necessary. I just think aesthetically it looks really nice. I'm gonna just kind of clean up this garnish a little bit. And all I'm doing is I'm just taking a paring knife and going in a crescent shape, just kind of cleaning up some of those rougher edges from the Y peeler. Because what'll happen is once I coil it up and making a twist is pretty easy. You just kind of wrap it upon itself, kind of give it like a little bit of a pig's tail, and give it a nice little tug on each end, which will just kind of help hold its shape a little bit. And there you go. You have an old fashioned. Looks pretty nice there. And then, because no one else is here for me to share this with, since a lot of bars are shut down right now. Yeah, that's good. I know you guys can't taste it with me, so you have to kind of take my word on it. We will be making sure to share this recipe, so in case you guys didn't write it down, you're curious to make old fashions at home, we'll happily be sharing that with you at the end of the presentation. Also, as a last little thanks, as Kelly mentioned earlier, not only are you going to be receiving those 2 raw glasses from Connection, HPE, and Nutanix, if you schedule a one-on-one afterwards with those guys, they are offering gift cards for these, I believe it's original grain watches. I was looking at them a little bit earlier when the slide was sent to me, and they have some really cool options on there. I saw one of them that I'm actually pretty interested in is this really cool wood grain watch that was made from old bourbon barrels. And I'm not a big fan of smartwatches, so something a little bit more traditional. It's been something I've been meaning to look at, and having it made from like old whiskey barrels I think is super cool as well. But hopefully you guys learned a little bit about whiskey today, a little bit about its origins, different styles. Hopefully you can take this knowledge and start going on your own whiskey path and growing and asking questions and trying new whiskeys and kind of find out what kind of whiskey person you are. Because I'm a firm believer that everyone's a whiskey drinker. They just may not know it yet or haven't found the right whiskey for them. But thank you guys so much. I appreciate y'all's time today.
Thank you. Hey, Andrew, we did have one quick question. Is there a specific type of bitters we should be using?
So the fundamentalist in me says Angostura. That's just me, my personal preference. I really enjoy Angostura. Fee Brothers has some really awesome aromatic bitters. But the short answer is no. Find like a really awesome bitters you want to play around with. There's like, I mean, the bitter scene has been blowing up in the last, God, it's kind of crazy to think about, like 12 years since like the modern cocktail movement started. So like play around with it, experiment, like find some different bottles. There's a lot of producers like Bittermans, Fee Brothers. They have like little like bitters kits you can get. So they have like smaller bottles of a whole bunch of different flavors you can play around with. You can do like combinations. You can do like orange bitters. You can do like aromatic bitters, a combination of the two, or maybe even some chocolate. Yeah, old fashioned is kind of beautiful in its simplicity, and like you kind of like interchange like whiskey or bitters, as long as you kind of stay to the kind of like the essence of an old fashioned, like you can't really go wrong.
Cool. One more question we've got time for is, why do some bartenders put in a cherry? What are your thoughts on the cherry?
That is actually, okay, so not to sound like elitist or anything, that's actually kind of a holdover from Prohibition. So like the 30s and 40s. So what happened is there was kind of like a dark age or so, and like the late 1800s, early 1900s was like the golden age of bartending. It was like the Renaissance, you know, like that's whenever you see these old pictures of like bartenders dressed to the nines and like these like really ritzy hotels, and like they were kind of like rock stars or like movie stars in that sense. That was kind of like the height of it. And then Prohibition happened, and a lot of these guys left the country. You know, you have like the American Bar and the Savoy Hotel. That's started by Harry Craddock, if I remember correctly, who was an expat, left the country because his trade was illegal, and then went to a country where it was maybe a little bit more appreciated. And then, so what happened is once bars began to reopen, there was a 13-year gap between people that were like trained and like it was a craft and like the skills they developed over years. You had people that were picking up books, because it'd be probably similar to me trying to pick up one of y'all's books of like how like any of the cybersecurity stuff works. Is aside from like GPU and like RAM and stuff like that, my knowledge is pretty limited. It'd be like me picking up for what you guys seems very intuitive, and I would have no idea what I'm looking at. It was a similar thing. So they would see like all these like dash of this, glass of this, and all this other stuff, and like people would get really confused when they were trying to like dissect these like whiskey recipes. And that's kind of like how the whole like muddled orange and cherry thing kind of became a thing. But like I said, I mean, if you're making an old fashioned at home and you want a cherry in there, and that's like how you enjoy your old fashions, you're more than welcome to. Like there's no problem with that. But yeah, it's kind of like where not to go on like this long tangent, but yeah, it's kind of where the whole like cherry thing came from.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining. We had a great session with you, and be on the lookout for your gifts and a follow-up email of how we can schedule some time with you to get that cool watch.
Andrew, I just want to say on behalf of Connection, we really appreciate the partnership with Nutanix and HPE, and this was outstanding. A lot of good learning here in the second half. I think we always have really strong learning on the IT side, but this is what polishes the game right here. So really appreciate that.
Hey, no, likewise. I feel like if I keep doing these, eventually I'm gonna have some idea of like what you guys are talking about. I feel like each time I'm like, oh, cool. It's like VRAM. Like I recently built a computer. So like I started kind of like learning all this stuff. I'm like, oh, I like know this from like presentations I've been on. Like I know this information. So consider it mutually beneficial, sir.
Outstanding. Work on the barter system. A lot available there.
Hey, bartering's alive and well with me, man. And I know HPE, I got one of their gaming monitors, the Omen, and it's pretty slick. So I am totally open to bartering with whomever is whoever I need to get in contact with that for.
All right. Thank you to all the customers for hanging with us this whole time. This was really special. Thank you.